Waste any time here because this is a shorter session than usual. And as I told a couple of the others, I could probably talk for at least an hour about this subject. So I won't waste any time here. This is food for thought. It is about how we use food in our writing. And it's just a little kind of a bite-sized, had to do that piece of information for us about how we typically do this. And maybe this is something you've noticed before, but I certainly noticed it as a copy editor. So very quickly, in case anyone's new to allegory editing, these are the services that we offer. We'd love to work with you, and here's how to reach us. And here's my email address. If anyone has any questions or comments or anything, please feel free to reach out. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. I found an interesting article that I thought did a good job of summarizing how we see food in books. The first kind of food in books is food that is served by an author to characters who are not expected to taste it. So this I interpret as food that just accompanies a story. It's there, but it's not, a heavy focus. Then we have food that is served by an author to characters in order to show who they are. And I would say this would be true for fiction and nonfiction. We do see that food can be used to reveal character and to reveal traits about someone, whether they're eating um, caviar or a Velveeta cheese sandwich. We try to stay away from stereotyping people, but it can show interesting personality traits. Then we have food that an author cooks for characters in order to eat it with them. And this I would interpret as food that is part of the focus of a story, not the entire focus, but it's featured quite prominently. And then last, we have food that an author cooks for characters, but actually serves to the reader. And this would be where food is the story, or the author might pause the story to really focus on the food. So I have some examples to share with you. When you attend workshops with me, you usually end up being read to, and so I hope everyone enjoys that as much as I do. But that's the best way, I think, to look at how we use food in fiction. So my first example is from Louise Penny's Inspector Gamache series, which is a favorite of mine, and I often use it as an example. But in her series, the bistro, Olivier's bistro, is a major part of the setting, and it appears in almost every book. And I thought it was fun to go back and see when it was first introduced to the reader in the first book, Still Life. So we have Inspector Gamache uh, going there for the first time. It was easy to spot with its blue and white awnings and round wooden tables and chairs on the sidewalk. A few people were sipping coffee, all eyes on him as he made his way along the commons. Once his eyes adjusted to the inside of the bistro, he saw not the one largest room he'd expected, but two rooms, each with its own open fireplace, now crackling with cheery fires. The chairs and tables were a comfortable mishmash of antiques. A few tables had armchairs in faded heirloom materials. Each piece looked as though it had been born there. He'd done enough antique hunting in his life to know good from bad, and that diamond point in the corner with the display of glass and tableware was a rare find. At the back of this room, the cash register stood on a long wooden bar. Jars of licorice pipes and twists, cinnamon sticks, and bright gummy bears shared the counter with small individual boxes of cereal. The woods had been chilly, and the thought of a cafe au lait in front of this open fire was too good, and maybe a licorice pipe or two. Gamache bit into a grilled chicken and roasted vegetable baguette and decided he was going to enjoy meal times in this place. Some of the officers took a beer, but not Gamache, who preferred ginger beer. The pile of sandwiches quickly disappeared. And with that, um, Olivier's Bistro becomes one of the main settings in the series so that the reader, now having been introduced, can return to it with the characters and feel really just as comfortable there. And boy, do I wish I could go there in real life. So that is one way that we use food to establish a sense of place and to help describe the setting. The next example comes from the novel Heartburn by Nora Ephron. And in this one, which was made into a movie that's kind of a favorite for a lot of people. But in this one, the main character is a cookbook writer. And so this is the kind of fiction where the food, it doesn't stay in the background. It really is an important part of it. But um, Ephron does an interesting she has an interesting way of incorporating recipes or instructions in second person point of view, just kind of telling the reader, this is how you make the perfect 4-minute egg, or this is what you do to get the perfect vinaigrette. But in this case, we're getting some background information about the character, and it's sort of revealed through this little passage about food. And in this passage, the main character is wishing she could talk to her mother. I would like to ask her what a person who is 7 months pregnant is supposed to do when her husband turns out to be in love with someone else. But even in the old days, my mother was a washout at hardcore mothering. Had I been able to talk to her at that moment of crisis, she probably would have said something fabulously brittle, like, take notes. Then she would have gone into the kitchen and toasted almonds. You melt some butter in a frying pan, add whole blanched almonds, and saute until they're golden brown with a few little burned parts. Drain lightly and salt and eat with a nice stiff drink. Men are little boys, she would have said as she lifted her glass. Don't stir or you'll bruise the ice cubes. So I like that one because it allows the food to kind of do the job of indicating what the main conflict is, and then some background about this person's relationship with her mother. Okay, next example. We had to include a cozy mystery that focuses on food. And this one, I just happened to find this book in our local bookstore, and it stood out to me because I knew I would be doing this workshop. And it's set in a restaurant um, in Oceanside, New Jersey. And I'm sure you've seen or read one of the many series that exists that really the food is everything to the series. It's kind of the premise for the series, certainly the premise for the mystery. In this case, this main character has gone back home to Oceanside. She's going to try to write a book. And so she's kind of escaping home to have a place to work. And I'm not going to read the whole passage here, but it's about grandma's fresh marinara sauce and kind of focuses on the tomatoes. But this is such a popular genre, and you can find series set in coffee houses, food trucks, bed and breakfasts, catering businesses, all of that. And interestingly, I kind of noticed as I was browsing through them that they often have cats in them too. A lot of these covers, we see the pasta or the pizza or the coffee, and then there's a cat somewhere too. So I kind of appreciated that connection there. But we certainly have a lot of these types of series out there featuring food. Okay. Using food to advance the story. Um, the writer Alexander McCall Smith is a really prolific writer, and this is one of his maybe less well-known books, but I happened to find it at the library and really enjoyed it. In this case, it's two people talking. They're in a relationship. They're not married, but they're partners, and their relationship is not going to make it. And the discussion, which talks about food, sort of illustrates the divide. So we have Paul. Perhaps this world is divided into dog and cat factions, just as it is into those who like chocolate and those who like strawberries. Gloria laughed. Really? There are many, millions, I suspect. who adore both chocolates and strawberries. There are people who eat those strawberries covered with chocolate. Paul thought about the taste wheel in one of his kitchen encyclopedias. Chocolate was earthy while strawberries were fruity, and he was sure that they were on different segments of the wheel. Let me tell you, Gloria, strawberry and chocolate do not go together. They just don't. Yes, they do, said Gloria. I like them. I won't argue, said Paul. So, in that discussion, you can certainly see not only their character, their personalities. Paul is sort of a rule follower, Gloria is more whimsical. Um, but you can also see that part of the plot is going to be that they are not together and they go separate ways. So, that one was kind of fun. The next one, I had to include this coffee. How many times do we see characters drinking coffee or tea in a story, and just all the time? It'd be almost hard to find a novel or any kind of work where somebody wasn't at some point drinking a hot beverage. This one just stood out to me because it mentioned Starbucks and used it as part of the setting. And in this case, the main character is simply doing an investigation into a grisly murder situation. And she wants to ask questions of another character, and he's hungover. So she takes him to Starbucks for coffee in hopes that she can perk him up and then get some information out of him. But I won't read it word for word, but it's so interesting because a lot of times in fiction and nonfiction, we're not only using coffee as a prop, I guess, if you will, but we're also going to comment on whether it's good or bad. It seems like that is often part of the deal where it's either just the worst coffee the person's ever had, or it's strong and good, and so therefore that's a good thing. So that comes up a lot. And now you'll probably notice it in everything you read. Now that I have mentioned it, I certainly notice it a lot. Okay, the next example is a series that was new to me, and one of our workshop attendees mentioned it to me, and I was so excited to explore this a little bit. The author is Rex Stout, and he wrote the Nero Wolfe series in the 19 from between 1934 and 1975, wrote 72 Nero Wolfe stories. So this was a whole new world for me. And Nero Wolfe, who is a detective, does like food, and there's a lot about his food, but very interesting is his assistant detective, Archie Goodwin, who's a guy in his 30s, and he does a lot for Nero. He's the first person narrator, and he is always just telling us what he ate, what he ordered. The food is not really that important to the plot. It's not even necessarily that important to establishing atmosphere or anything like that. It's simply that Archie is going to tell us what he's eating, whether he's having a ham sandwich or a, fancy avocado salad or something. He's going to give a little critique of it, and it's really just sprinkled throughout. So that was a fun example for me to come upon, and it does reveal maybe the detail-oriented character of a detective to be commenting on these kind of details. Okay, the next one is from a short story, and this writer uses food a lot in her writing. Um, in this case, it's revealing character. It's kind of revealing the spiraling downward of a character. It's a middle-aged woman, Lorena. Um, she's a cancer survivor. She has been through a lot. Her life maybe didn't turn out just how she hoped it would. And in this scene, she is kind of in the midst of wanting to go and visit her first love again and maybe see if there's anything left there. And it doesn't go very well. So we have a really interesting description of her making chili. Inside her house, she pulls groceries from the bags, finally exhaling the foul air she sucked in just before she smacked that woman. With meat cleaver in hand, Lorena hatchets the sirloin. Hunks of red meat leak blood all over the cutting board like severed tumors. She wipes her hands on a towel and leaves the meat chunks goes to her computer and clicks the keys in persistence, searching for Rick Rasmussen. Nothing. She goes back to the kitchen, leaving bloody fingerprints on the keyboard. Lorena slides a long dicing knife from its wooden sheath and cuts an onion in half, then in quarters, and begins mincing the portions into fine pieces. She lets the tears roll, blinking away their sting. So there we have kind of a dark use of food. Um, Another example of food revealing character. In this novel, the main character, at least he's the main character at the start of the novel. He actually doesn't stay the main character necessarily, but he's a chef and his wife travels a lot from work for work. And in this scene, he is kind of sadly coming to the realization that she's not just on a work trip. She's probably not coming back. So he's at a farmer's market tasting a different variety of tomato. He bit into it like an apple, and orange water flung across his mouth and stuck to his beard. The sensation bothered him for just a moment before the flavor of the heirloom broke across his palate. The approach was wonderfully sweet, but not sugary or overpowering. There was just a whisper of citric tartness. As he chewed the moonglow's firm flesh, he closed his eyes to concentrate on the vanishing sweetness in his mouth. He thought of Cynthia and how the last time they were here, they bought Roma VFs for a dish to pair with a light-bodied Corvina Veronese. He thought about how much she'd love this, how she'd be coming up with wine pairings for each of this guy's tomatoes, and wondered where she was in California right then. He thought about how this trip had been the longest yet, and how it had been 3 days since he'd heard from her. So this novel takes on more of what I would call kind of a foodie tone, a little bit more of the uh, appreciative, literary talking about food that we might see in fiction. It's a good book. All right. Then we have some nonfiction. I thought I would try to include an essay. In this essay, this is just a classic way to use food and to use a good attention getter at the start of your essay to really grab the reader's attention. And in this case, it's the very um, lowly can of tuna, I guess you could say, the very probably typical American basic food. And the writer says, the first time my mother and I open a can of tuna, I am 9 years old. We stand in the doorway of the kitchen in semi-darkness, the can tilted toward daylight. I want to eat what the kids at school eat: bologna, hot dogs, salami, foods my parents find repugnant because they contain pork and meat byproducts, crushed bone and hair, glued together by chemicals and fat. Although she has never been able to tolerate the smell of fish, my mother buys the tuna, hoping to satisfy my longing for American food. Indians, of course, do not eat such things. The tuna smells fishy, which surprises me because I can't remember anyone's tuna sandwich actually smelling like fish. And the tuna in those sandwiches doesn't look like this, pink and shiny, like an internal organ. In fact, this looks similar to the bad foods my mother doesn't want me to eat. She is silent, holding her face away from the can while peering into it like a half-blind bird. What's wrong with it? I ask. She has no idea. My mother does not know that the tuna everyone else's mothers made for them was tuna salad. So this mom and this food is illustrating this balancing between two cultures that the child of an immigrant would face and that they often describe. The mother doesn't know about, mayo or Miracle Whip or any of those other American things that would turn this into what this daughter is really wanting, this American food. All right, my final example. I think we're doing okay here for time. Not great, but okay. Love this book. And in this case, the food reveals character. It's a premise for the book. It illustrates a cultural tradition. It's just really good. In this case, we have a mother who has passed away. She has left something for her kids. It's a Jamaican cake that she has made and put in the freezer. Cake made of dried fruits, nuts, rum, and she has left instructions for her kids. And this is the lawyer showing them what's been left for them. Go ahead, Mr. Mitch says, nodding at the packet. Byron cuts open the envelope and shakes out its contents, a USB drive and a handwritten note. He reads the note out loud. It's so typically Ma. B and B, there's a small black cake in the freezer for you. Don't throw it out. Black cake. Byron catches himself smiling. Ma and Dad used to share a slice of cake every year to mark their anniversary. It wasn't the original wedding cake, they said, not anymore. Ma would make a new one every 5 years or so, one layer only, and put it in the freezer. Still, she insisted that any black cake, steeped as it was in rum and port, could have lasted the full length of their marriage. I want you to sit down together and share the cake when the time is right. You'll know when. Benny covers her mouth with one hand. Love, Ma. And this is so good. I mean, it's some critics have said, oh, that's a little bit of a cliche, somebody leaving this mysterious thing, but I loved it. Later, the daughter does find the recipe and it's not even specific, which I also loved. It doesn't give any measurements or anything. It's more like hints for how to go forward with the recipe. And I thought, what a wonderful analogy to somebody leaving, lessons. We can't tell people how to do things exactly, but we can leave hints and tips. And I just thought, oh, what a great way to use the food in that case. So love that one. Okay, so the copy editing and proofreading, I had to talk a little bit about that. This is the kind of stuff that I love to look up as part of my job as a copy editor and proofreader. And these are some of the things that come up a lot for me. Everything from just the basic spelling, capitalization, whether something's a brand name or not. Do people eat this food in a certain part of the country? How do you make this? Like when you're using a coffee press, what order do the steps go in, and at what point would you stir? How do you make, if you live in the Midwest, how do you make lefse, and what would the writer need to say first? Things like that. I do a lot of that kind of little fact checking. And not being a big consumer of alcohol myself, I always have to look up things about wine and cocktails and bar terms. Um, I don't have as much trouble with beer because that's a little easier to know, but I look up a lot of this stuff, coffee drinks, all that kind of stuff. So what I have to finish up here is just kind of a fun little, we can kind of quiz ourselves as we go through. This one, I knew what the answer was. I did, but I always recommend to people that you should check just in case. And in this case, I was right. It does end with an M. But I just thought, what if I've always had it wrong? So these kinds of things are good to look up. The word kebab. I've run into this a couple times. We at Allegory follow Merriam-Webster. This is how Merriam-Webster spells it. So we would choose that. I mean, the main thing is probably consistency, right? How about this? What is capitalized? What is not? The bunt pan is a trademark name, so it's at the start of the sentence here, but even if it wasn't, it would need to be capitalized. How about this? Cheeses. There's so many different rules and spellings and capitalizations. It would just be Gouda capitalized, not, you don't even have to say Gouda cheese. And then what about a cheese? I thought, well, okay, so that's Gouda. What about pepper jack or another kind? It's not considered fancy. It doesn't need to be capitalized. It's not the proper name of anything. So you just use it, 2 words. That's what we do with that. So how about this? Hyphens, the bane of most writers' existence, mine included. Half and half, these do work together to form a noun, and so we do hyphenate them. How about this one? There are so many different varieties for some of these food types that maybe we have it wrong. Black-eyed peas, you hyphenate, and of course, we can't ignore that there's also the musical group Black Eyed Peas, and this is how they prefer their name. They don't use a hyphen for that. And which one is correct here? Kiwi fruit, 2 words, kiwi fruit, 1 word. It's kiwi fruit, 1 word. And if you just said kiwi, that's a bird. So that's something different entirely, right? So I made you a massive list of stuff that I've come across, and it's just fun to look over it. I won't spend a lot of time on these things because I've taken up almost all of our time. I knew I was going to do that, shoot. But these are just fun to look at. They're things that are either regional or a different country, um, different spellings, a brand name that isn't spelled like you think it would be, uh, differences in recipes. I included the last 2 items, Pirate's Booty snacks and Hello Panda, that's a candy brand, because I was thinking about how sometimes when you use a brand name, it becomes a distraction. It causes somebody to pause and think about it when you didn't want them to. So you kind of have to be careful. You might just want to say popcorn instead of Pirate's Booty, unless it's really relevant that it's that brand, it's somebody's favorite or something like that. So with that, you'll all get this PowerPoint later and you can have fun looking at this list, and I'm sure you have many that you could add. But again, I took too much time. I talked a little too long, but hoping you might have some questions or comments. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here and come back this way.
I just want to say I have spelled cardamom and said it wrong my entire life. I had no
Oh,
idea it
well,
ended with an M.
we all have those. I mean, I have multiple, and I look things up over and over. I've often thought, should I be just wallpapering my wall with these things? But then I would have to search for them on the wall, and that would be the same as Googling them. So I haven't done that, but there's so many. So what else? Does anybody have any funny ones that have come up or
I just have a question, Amy.
okay?
How would you, so as a copy editor, if you're getting something, say, I was just thinking about the kebab one because I've seen it different ways in different
Mm-hmm.
contexts. And if you're getting it, and it's maybe set in a particular place, or the writer comes from a particular cultural background and their spelling is at odds with, Merriam-Webster, how would you reconcile that with sort of, or how would you approach that with them with, making
Um,
sure it's correct?
if I knew that they knew more than I did, which is very, very likely, I would simply say, this is how Merriam-Webster spells it. Um, your choice, and as long as we're consistent, you know, obviously the dictionary can't be a substitute for someone's life experience and knowledge and culture. And so I would probably only mention it if it was used inconsistently, or I would just say, here's some information for whatever it's worth, you know, so.
We have a great question in the chat. Is there any problem or issue, and I'm assuming we're talking about trademark violation, is there any problem with using brand names and do you avoid them?
Elena, do you know more about that maybe than I do in terms of the
Yeah,
trademark
I
side?
so typically the way I think about it, the way I hear people talk about it, my understanding is it's fine to use a brand name unless you're doing something illegal with it. So, for example, if you're going to chop somebody up with a set of knives, I wouldn't give the brand of that knife, right? I've told this story before, but there was a writer who had their killer get giant garbage bags and a shovel and a hatchet from Home Depot, and Home Depot went
Mm.
after them. So you have to be a little careful about context. Otherwise, it's free advertising, right? So brand names are fine with it. And there are a number of items, Kleenex, Crescent Wrench, that are actually brand names, but we use them universally. So as Amy mentioned, make sure you have them capitalized. But you know, everybody thinks of any tissue as Kleenex, right? We use that as a generic term, even though it's not. So to answer the question about the legalities, just think about what is it adding to use that name? Like I would never poison a Starbucks coffee. I would never do that because Starbucks is going to, if they read it, have a problem. But I might say I went to a local coffee chain, got a latte, and dropped in the poison. I can absolutely do that. So you just have to think about context.
Right. And I would think just in terms of using the brand name for your story, sometimes they're very relevant because it's that particular brand that your father loved or something like that. But if you think that someone would read it and be distracted and pulled out of the moment, then I would skip it unless it seems especially important. Like if you wouldn't mind someone being pulled out of the moment, then go ahead. But
Well, and
um,
Amy, like you said, it tells us so much about character. You know, like my granny drank Folgers coffee, right? She had her Folgers instant coffee. And I think to add that word in about maybe an older person, you know, my granny lived alone. She made her Folgers coffee every day. She was a
mhm,
Midwesterner, right? I
right.
think
That's a
it can
perfect
show
use
so
for it.
much. Yeah, I
But
think
then
you're
again, if you're just describing, oh, I went to the kitchen and made coffee, you probably wouldn't say, I went to the kitchen and made my Folgers coffee. Then it just seems like an ad, unnecessarily. So, yeah, you just have to kind of have a good feel for when it seems relevant, I would say. Yeah. So, what else? Anybody else have any fun ones? Now you're just going to be, when you sit down to read later today, you're going to be like, oh, there's some food, there's a beverage. There it is. You're gonna notice them
I
too
wonder,
much.
I wonder, Amy, if you want to say anything about if you're writing in English for an English audience and you have food terms that come from a non-English culture, do you italicize or not? And how do
Oh,
you make that decision?
that's a really good question, and one that we at Allegory have talked about a lot. And there are basically two schools of thought on that. Elena, can I bug you to explain it? Because you're so good at explaining this issue.
I know I love this issue, and we do, and I think we all think slightly differently. That we are moving more and more towards not using italics. I find that problematic because to me it's a little bit appropriation. So when we have a word that's clearly part of the lexicon, if you go get a taco, right? If you have sushi, these are words that are in the English language as understandable. We don't need to italicize those. But if we use something that is unusual, in my opinion, as a white writer, if I'm talking about some culture other than mine, I italicize because I'm not stating it as mine. I am recognizing it as a part of another culture and giving it credence. But there are people who do fall on the side of that it's othering something, or it's making an item feel like it's separate or different than that. So that's my position. I lean towards italicizing words which are unusual, food that is unusual and not necessarily part of the lexicon. But Andrea, Christine, I think we don't all completely agree. Andrew, what do you do?
Um, I usually ask Amy. I think I probably fall more where you fall with italicizing it if it's not part of the lexicon, but I don't know that I have such a strong feeling about why I do it.
Mhm.
That's just sort of what I see and what makes sense. And um, it's an interesting thing because language does get absorbed and that can kind of happen little by little. And yeah, I don't have such strong feelings about my reasoning, but that's what I do. I don't disagree with your reasoning. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
put that
You're
behind it.
not as virulent as I am about we will not appropriate, we will acknowledge the
Well, I mean, it's not that I don't think we should be careful about appropriating. I think we should. I just don't know that I see that as a
right.
particular
That's what I'm
example of
saying.
it.
That
Yeah.
that particular thing
Yeah.
isn't such a
Yeah.
yeah. Christine, do you
Yeah,
do
I've also worked with where you kind of italicize an unfamiliar word the first time around, but that you if it's going to keep coming up, you're not going to do it all the way through the book because it gets annoying. Um, and I've just been watching how people do this, and
Mhm.
particularly if somebody's I've read some books lately that are really characters and authors who are working in two languages.
Yeah,
And italicizing is kind of
that's very
out the
different. Yeah.
window. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting to me to see how it's going to evolve.
Well, the difference in that though is that it's not unfamiliar to the author or to the character, to the narrator. So you could also make an argument that, I mean,
Yeah. Well, yeah, and in some things that I've worked on, it's that word wouldn't be unfamiliar to the character or the narrator. It just might be unfamiliar to somebody else who doesn't know the book yet, or doesn't know that person's experience. So,
Yeah, context is a lot. I would agree with that. So, for example, if I had a character where it was a food in their culture, I probably wouldn't italicize. Like there is a context to it. There
yeah.
is a context to it.
mm,
For me, it's a little bit tricky if you italicize once and not later because it feels like an inconsistency. So
Mhm.
that is a little, so it also is like maybe how often it's getting used. Like if it's every paragraph, for chapters, that would be different than if it's once or twice. But for me, then you get into that question of consistency. And I want to hit a comment in the chat window. Amy, did you have anything you wanted to add about the
No, I
italicizing?
liked what you said. I can see all angles of this and I find it really interesting and I think it's something we can all continue to watch how people
Yeah.
do it.
Excellent. There's a comment about very specific editing might watch for two main dishes plated without a side dish. That would be a big error, right?
It
At a
would
fancy
be.
restaurant that you'd plate
Mhm.
two main dishes without a side dish. I
That
love that
might
specificity.
be a good reason to have as a beta reader, somebody who would know a lot about that. Your copy editor might know enough to sort of question something, but might not know all of those things. But yeah, that's something that a reader would notice. It would annoy them,
Yeah.
and you don't want that, right? We don't want
Yeah.
to
If you're
annoy
going
the
to write
reader.
a foodie thing, foodies
Get
are
it
going to
right.
catch it.
Yeah. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, we have hit all of the questions in the chat window. Amy, any last note you want to add?
No, I just hope that this gives you all some food for thought.
And we're all going to go eat and drink. And
Yes,
yes,
that's
Amy,
right.
fantastic presentation. I love
Yeah.
how you brought this in and our use of food. And I'm really going to have that in my mind as I forge forward in
Oh,
my current
great.
products.
And I do want to
Projects.
thank everybody for coming. This is such a fun topic. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. So.
thank you.
Wonderful. You're getting lots of great feedback. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.